There's a question that nobody in Washington wants to answer. There's a body of water sitting on the border of Nevada and Arizona that has been hiding secrets for over 40 years. Not metaphorical secrets, not political ones. Actual human beings, sealed inside metal barrels, resting on the floor of the largest man-made reservoir in the United States. And nobody found them. Not investigators, not divers, not the federal government, until the water itself decided it was time to talk. The drought did what decades of law enforcement could not. It pulled back the curtain. And what was underneath was not just crime, it was history. Buried history, violent history. A history that powerful people had every reason to keep submerged. The question you should be asking right now is not why these things were hidden. The question is, how many more are still down there? There is something deeply unsettling about a reservoir that is disappearing. Not a pond, not a creek. Lake Mead and Lake Powell are the largest human-made reservoirs in the United States, part of a system that provides water to more than 40 million people, tribes, agriculture, and industry, across Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, and across the southern border into Mexico, 40 million people. Think about that number. That is not a regional utility. That is a civilization-scale lifeline. And for the past 2 decades, it has been slowly, quietly, catastrophically draining away. Not because of a broken pipe, not because of sabotage, because the American Southwest made a bet with nature, and nature is calling that bet in full. But here's where it gets strange, because when a body of water that enormous starts to retreat, it does not just reveal dry, cracked earth. It reveals everything that was ever thrown into it, dropped into it, or deliberately hidden inside it. And Lake Mead has been hiding things for a very long time. Things that were never supposed to surface. Things that were placed at the bottom of that water with great deliberation, wrapped in rust and silence, paid for in blood. And one morning in May 2022, a boater changed everything. On May 1st, 2022, a boater noticed a barrel stuck in the mud and made the grisly discovery of a body inside. Las Vegas police believe he was a murder victim who died from a gunshot wound, with his killers believed to have dumped him in the lake in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Read that again. A body sealed inside a metal barrel, placed at the bottom of a reservoir that was, at the time, nearly 200 feet deep in places. Placed there not by accident, not by flood. Placed there by someone who believed with complete confidence that it would never be found. Someone who understood that the desert keeps secrets. Someone who understood that water keeps secrets better. But here's the thing about secrets. They have weight. And weight sinks. And sometimes, when enough time passes, what sinks eventually rises again. The gruesome discovery came as water levels at the lake had reached their lowest levels in more than half a century. Officials predicted it could be just the first of more grim finds. Las Vegas Police Lieutenant Ray Spencer stood in front of cameras and said something that sent a quiet chill through everyone who was paying attention. He said there was a very good chance that as the water level continued to drop, they were going to find additional human remains. He was not speculating. He was not being dramatic. He was simply reading the mathematics of a disappearing lake and the history of the city that surrounds it. And he was right in a way that even he may not have been fully prepared for. For the 5th time since May, authorities discovered human remains in the reservoir where water levels had dropped to record lows. 5 separate sets of human remains. In the same summer, in the same drying lake, each discovery pulling more investigators, more cameras, more historians, more uncomfortable questions about what Las Vegas really was when the neon lights went down and the cameras stopped rolling. Because the bodies were not the only discovery, not even close. The lake was giving back far more than the dead. What most people are not seeing in this story is its true scale. The barrel containing the gunshot victim was found near Hemingway Harbor, close to where pleasure boats dock and tourists rent jet skis. This was not some remote, inaccessible corner of the reservoir. This was prime recreational territory, which means that for decades, families had been swimming, boating, and celebrating anniversaries directly above a crime scene, directly above what investigators would quietly begin describing as one of the most significant pieces of organized crime evidence to emerge in a generation. And nobody knew. Nobody could know, because the water had buried it all perfectly. Michael Franzese, a former Colombo crime family capo, visited the lake and confirmed that Lake Mead was the perfect place to do the mob's business at that time, noting that in the 1970s and 1980s, Las Vegas was a city where you heard things, and certain locations along the lake were well understood within certain circles. A former mob capo, standing at the edge of a drying lake, talking on camera about how well-designed a disposal site it was, there is something almost surreal about that moment, because it confirms what historians and law enforcement had quietly suspected for years, but could never prove. Lake Mead was not just a reservoir. During the most violent era of organized crime in Las Vegas history, it was a cemetery, one with very specific architecture. And here is where the history gets darker and the stakes get higher. The timing of the body in the barrel suggests the killing occurred between the 1970s and the early 1980s, coinciding with the most violent period in Las Vegas's past, an era of unprecedented street crime and underworld killings. This was not random violence. This was the era of the Chicago outfit's iron grip on Las Vegas, the era of Tony the Ant Spilotro, whose real-life story became so notorious that Martin Scorsese built a character around him. Spilotro represented the Chicago mob in Las Vegas in the 1970s and headed a crew dubbed the Hole in the Wall Gang for drilling through walls to gain entry to homes and businesses. He served as the model for the character Nicky Santoro, portrayed by actor Joe Pesci in Martin Scorsese's 1995 movie Casino. Think about what that means. The violence you watched in that film, the buried bodies, the hidden murders, the calculated disappearances, was not Hollywood invention. It was an edited version of documented reality. And some of that reality, it now appears, was anchored 60, 80, 100 feet underwater in the desert's largest reservoir. Researchers believe the body in the barrel could be one of three victims: George J. Vandermark, William Crespo, or Johnny Pappas. The three men, who disappeared around the same time in the mid-1970s, each held links to the same powerful Las Vegas mob front company, Argent Corp. Their bodies were never found. Three men, three different stories, three different reasons the mob wanted them gone. Vandermark had double-crossed the Stardust slot machine operation. Crespo had turned state's evidence after a cocaine bust. Pappas had been skimming proceeds from the Echo Bay Resort on Lake Mead itself, which carries a grim irony so perfect it almost sounds invented. The man who may have been killed for stealing from a casino operation near the lake may now be resting beneath the same waters his job once overlooked. Jeff Schumacher, a mob historian and vice president at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, confirmed that killing somebody and putting them in a barrel and dumping them in water is actually a common mob tactic going back to the 1800s, and that the late 1970s and early 1980s were a very active time for organized crime in Las Vegas, a time of a lot of conflicts, when a number of individuals linked to the mob went missing for various reasons. The barrel itself is a signature. Investigators know this. Criminologists know this. It is not a coincidence or a copycat tactic. It is a methodology, a protocol. Jeff Schumacher stated plainly that a barrel has a signature of a mob hit, pointing to the death of John Handsome Johnny Roselli, a mid-1950s Las Vegas mobster who disappeared in 1976, only to have his body discovered in a 55-gallon steel drum floating off the coast of Miami. The barrel method is documented. It is consistent. And now it has been confirmed decades after the fact, at the bottom of a drying American reservoir. But here is where the story shifts, because the mob history, as chilling as it is only one layer of what Lake Mead was concealing. The water had been holding something else, something much older, something that rewrites not just the criminal record of Las Vegas, but the military record of the entire nation. A sunken World War II-era Higgins landing craft that used to be nearly 200 feet underwater began being revealed near the Lake Mead Marina as the waterline continued to lower in the Lake Mead National Recreation Area. 200 feet. That is a depth at which ordinary divers do not operate. That is a depth that requires specialized equipment, pre-planned dives, careful decompression. For decades, this vessel sat in absolute darkness in near-freezing water, invisible to every person who ever sailed above it. And then the drought came, and the lake fell. And suddenly, there it was. A weapon of war, resting in the desert, far from any ocean it was ever meant to touch. The National Park Service confirmed that the Higgins craft was still wrapped in armor plating and suspected that this World War II surplus craft was put into service on the lake for various reasons and then partially salvaged before it sank in its current location. Though whether it sank by accident or was purposely sunk to get rid of a vessel no longer of use remains unclear. That final phrase deserves its own moment of attention. Whether it sank by accident or was purposely sunk. This is the National Park Service, an arm of the federal government, openly acknowledging that they do not know how a military vessel ended up on the bottom of a reservoir. They are not sure if it was an accident. They are not sure if it was deliberate. What they are sure of is that it was there. It was real. And for the better part of a century, nobody who was boating on Lake Mead's surface had any idea they were sailing above a piece of D-Day history. Higgins Industries in New Orleans built several thousand landing craft from 1942 to 1945. Around 500 Higgins boats were deployed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day. These vessels carried American soldiers onto the beaches of occupied France. They were the tools of liberation. Their design, shallow draft, front-loading, drop ramp, changed the course of the Second World War. General Dwight Eisenhower himself credited Andrew Higgins, the man who designed them, with winning the war. And one of these vessels had been sitting, forgotten, in a recreational lake in Nevada for generations. Not in a museum, not in a memorial. At the bottom of a desert reservoir, visited only by fish and darkness, until the drought finally gave it back to the daylight. And this is where everything changes, because if you step back from the individual discoveries, the bodies, the barrels, the wartime vessel, and look at the full picture, you begin to understand something far more disturbing than any single find. Lake Mead was not just collecting secrets randomly. Lake Mead was, in a very real sense, serving as the final archive of mid-20th century American history. The violence that built Las Vegas, the wars that shaped the nation, the environmental recklessness that is now threatening the survival of the entire American Southwest. All of it compressed into one body of water, all of it now being reluctantly returned. When full, the United States' largest reservoir can reach an elevation of 1,220 feet and holds 3 trillion gallons of water. 9.3 trillion gallons. That is not a lake. That is an inland sea. And as of recent measurements, that inland sea has been reduced to a fraction of its former self. Lake Mead is currently 33% full, while Lake Powell upstream sits at just 28% full. If Lake Powell's water levels drop by an additional 50 feet, the water behind Glen Canyon Dam would be trapped, limiting deliveries to California, Arizona, and Nevada, and preventing the dam from generating hydropower. There is a term for what happens when a reservoir drops below functional capacity permanently. They call it dead pool. And the federal government's own data suggests that Lake Powell could reach dead pool by the summer of 2027 if significant cuts to water usage are not made. Summer of 2027. That is not a distant projection. That is not a worst-case scenario buried in a footnote. That is an operational timeline being discussed in federal briefings right now. A group of 6 researchers from across the Colorado River Basin warned in a new report that the Colorado River system that Las Vegas relies on for life in the Mojave Desert is nearer to collapse than ever before, and that it is no longer a distant concern that Nevada, California, and Arizona could suffer from water delivery issues due to constraints of dam infrastructure unless more water conservation happens quickly. Nearer to collapse than ever before. These are not environmental activists. These are researchers with decades of hydrological data behind them. They are looking at the numbers, running the models, and arriving at conclusions that should be dominating the national conversation, but are instead buried beneath daily news cycles and political noise. The federal government is ready to cut Nevada's primary water supply by 40%, as projections for the Colorado River sink to new lows, with a preliminary plan from the Bureau of Reclamation that would reduce water allotted to the lower basin states, Nevada, Arizona, and California, by 3 million acre-feet. The lower basin's normal allotment is 7. 5 million acre-feet, meeting the needs of growing cities and farms across the region. A 40% cut to a region that is already operating under shortage conditions, to cities like Las Vegas, which hosts 40 million tourists every single year, to Phoenix, which is one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the entire United States, to the agricultural valleys of California, which produce a significant portion of the country's food supply. This is not a conservation adjustment. This is a structural reckoning. For more than a century, a collection of deals, treaties, and legal agreements have divided up the Colorado River's water, a vital supply for 40 million people, 7 states in the U.S. and 2 in Mexico, 30 federally recognized tribal nations, and 5 million acres of agriculture. Demand has long outstripped supply, and climate-fueled megadrought and aridification have starved the river in recent decades. The original 1922 Colorado River Compact, the foundational legal agreement that divided the river's water between 7 states, was negotiated during one of the wettest periods in the region's recorded history. The negotiators believed they were dividing a river that carried 15 to 16 million acre-feet of water annually. The actual average, corrected across a longer historical record, is significantly lower. They divided water that didn't fully exist, and for a century, the system absorbed that miscalculation through a combination of wet years, snowpack, and optimistic accounting. Now the accounting has run out. Between October 2024 and the end of September 2025, only 5 million acre-feet of water was produced in the Colorado River watershed, which extends from western Wyoming and western Colorado through western New Mexico, Nevada, and Arizona. The compact promised 15 million acre-feet. The river delivered 5 million. That gap more than 6 million acre-feet is not a bad year. It is the new baseline. It is the arithmetic of collapse, playing out one dry season at a time. Snowpack in the Rocky Mountains has failed to deliver this water year, with water managers bracing for what is expected to be a runoff season that rivals 2002, the year that ushered in the modern notion of megadrought in the American West. Record low levels at Lake Mead could have hydropower production at Hoover Dam as soon as this fall. Hoover Dam, the structure that created Lake Mead in the first place. The dam that, when it was completed in 1935, was the largest concrete structure ever built. The dam that was itself a statement of human ambition, proof that engineering could reshape geography, could redirect rivers, could turn desert into civilization. That dam, which has been producing electricity for the American Southwest for nearly a century, is now at risk of losing half its generating capacity because there's not enough water behind it. This is not a drought story, this is a civilization story. And here is the part that most coverage is not connecting. When the bodies were found in those barrels, when the World War II landing craft broke the surface, when the headlines were filled with photographs of a rusted vessel rising ghost-like from the mud, the story was framed as a curiosity, a dark wonder, something to be awed by and moved on from. But the discoveries were not a story about the past, they were a story about the future. Because every inch of shoreline that those bodies in that boat exposed represents water that is gone, water that is not coming back quickly, water that is now in emergency negotiations between 7 states, a federal government, and a river system that is quietly running out of margin. Federal deadlines have come and gone, and the stakes are higher than ever as climate change and overuse continue to push the Colorado River, on which 40 million people rely, to the edge. And still, the states are refusing to budge. California's lead water negotiator, J.B. Hamby, was direct about the failure. It's now 2025. We're here in a different hotel a couple years later, and the same problems are on the table. In the last 2 years, we've been spinning our wheels. Time has been wasted, and like water, that's a very precious resource, time has been wasted like water. That is not poetry. That is a crisis communication from someone who manages water for millions of people and understands exactly what the numbers mean. And what the numbers mean is this: the window for managed, negotiated solutions is narrowing rapidly. The alternative federal intervention, unilateral cuts, infrastructure failure, is not a hypothetical. It is a scheduled destination on the current trajectory. Nevada, California, and Arizona have proposed taking significant cuts to their share of the Colorado River with a plan that would deliver up to 2 million acre-feet of water savings through 2028. But the upper Colorado River Basin states Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming have called for third-party mediation as the two groups remain in impasse. 7 states, 1 river. And the negotiations have reached the point where they need a mediator just to sit in the same room together. Meanwhile, the water keeps evaporating. Meanwhile, the reservoir keeps dropping. Meanwhile, the shoreline keeps revealing what was buried beneath. There is a metaphor buried in this entire situation that is almost too precise to be coincidental. The mob used Lake Mead because they believed the water would keep their secrets forever. They believed that depth was permanent. They believed that what went down would stay down. They were operating on a fundamental assumption about the stability of the natural world. And that assumption turned out to be wrong. Not because of brilliant detective work, not because of advancing forensic technology, but because the environment itself changed. The lake changed. The climate changed. And what they thought was a permanent vault turned out to be a temporary hiding place with a very long timer. That is exactly what the broader water crisis represents. For a century, the American Southwest operated on an assumption of permanence. The river would always flow, the snowpack would always accumulate, the reservoirs would cycle between full and not quite full, but never approach the edge of functionality. Engineers built cities in the desert based on that assumption. Politicians signed water compacts based on that assumption. Real estate developers sold millions of homes based on that assumption. And that assumption, like the mob's confidence in the depth of Lake Mead, is now being tested by forces that do not negotiate, do not lobby, and do not respond to legal arguments. The water does what the water does, and right now what the water is doing is leaving. If the reservoir drops below 895 feet, it is considered a dead pool condition, which would jeopardize the Hoover Dam's ability to provide electricity, leaving nearly 3 million people in Arizona, California, and Nevada without power. Without power and without water simultaneously, in a region where summer temperatures routinely exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, in cities where air conditioning is not a luxury but a survival mechanism. The cascading consequences of dead pool conditions are not theoretical. Emergency planners have war-gamed this scenario. The outcomes are not comfortable, but here is what is equally important to understand and what gets lost in the apocalyptic framing that sometimes surrounds this issue. The discoveries at Lake Mead are also a reminder of what this water built. The Higgins boat resting on that muddy shore was not just a relic of military history. It was a symbol of the industrial ambition that created Lake Mead in the first place. The Higgins boat at Lake Mead was surplus to the war effort, sold off by the military in the years after World War II, and then used in surveys of the Colorado River before eventually being sold to a marina at Lake Mead and deliberately sunk to anchor or breakwater at a depth of nearly 185 feet. A vessel that helped win a world war was repurposed to survey the very river that would fill the reservoir that the war itself had helped the nation build. And then it was sunk deliberately to serve as infrastructure, to anchor a man-made breakwater at the bottom of a man-made lake behind a man-made dam in the middle of a desert where no major city was ever supposed to exist. That is not just history. That is the American story of the 20th century, compressed into a single rusted hull. The audacity, the ingenuity, the absolute refusal to accept natural limitations. And now, in the 21st century, the bill for that audacity is arriving. According to informed sources close to water management negotiations, the conversations happening right now between state water officials are unlike anything in the prior history of Colorado River governance. The 1922 compact was negotiated in a period of relative optimism. The 1944 treaty with Mexico was negotiated with surplus water on the table. Every subsequent agreement was built on the assumption of abundance. What is happening now is the first negotiation conducted explicitly in the context of scarcity, the first time that every party at the table knows, with mathematical certainty, that there is not enough water to satisfy every existing legal entitlement. Someone is going to receive less than they are legally owed. The only question is who and how much and when. Arizona will again lose 18% of its total Colorado River allocation, while Mexico's share goes down 5%, and the reduction for Nevada will stay at 7%. These cuts sound manageable in the abstract, but they are cuts layered on top of prior cuts, applied to cities and agricultural systems that were already operating at the margins of their water budgets. Arizona's 18% cut represents hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water that farms, cities, and communities had already planned around, budgeted for, and in many cases borrowed against. When that water disappears from the ledger, real consequences follow. Crops are not planted, subdivisions stall, industrial operations scale back. The invisible infrastructure of water allocation, which most people never think about, becomes suddenly and urgently visible, much like a body in a barrel rising from the floor of a drying lake. The real story here is layered in ways that a single news cycle cannot contain. It is a story about crime, about the organized violence that built modern Las Vegas in blood and brutality, and about how that violence believed it could outrun accountability by going deep enough. It is a story about war, about the instruments of liberation being repurposed into peacetime tools, and then forgotten, and then returned by a planet that keeps its own accounting. And it is a story about water, about a civilization that built itself on assumptions of permanence in a landscape that was never permanent to begin with, about the mathematics of a river that has been overdrawn for so long that the overdraft is now structural. What is most striking, if you look at all of it together, is the consistency of the theme. Everything that Lake Mead has been returning in these years of drought was placed there by human beings who were absolutely certain it would stay hidden. The mob enforcer who dropped that barrel into 60 feet of desert water believed with complete confidence that he was writing the end of a story. The engineers who sank a military vessel to serve as a breakwater believed they were making a permanent infrastructure decision. The water managers who signed century-old compacts believed they were managing a stable resource in a stable climate. Every single one of them was operating on a certainty that turned out to be an illusion. And now the lake is returning all of it, not as punishment, not as revelation, simply as physics, simply as the unavoidable consequence of a body of water that is losing more than it receives. What goes in must eventually come out if enough time passes and enough water disappears. The investigators are still working. The homicide division of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police still has an open case on the body in the barrel. The identity of the victim has not been confirmed. The remains found in the barrel were an outlier. As investigators said, the 4 other bodies discovered that same year were victims of accidental drownings. But that single barrel, that single murder victim sealed in rust and lowered into the dark, remains unidentified, unnamed, and connected to a network of organized violence that left no written records, no journals, no confessions. The mob, as historians note, was precise about its secrecy. What cannot be documented cannot be prosecuted. What rests beneath 200 feet of water cannot be exhumed, except now it can. Now the water is cooperating with investigators in ways that 4 decades of active police work never managed. Now the drought is doing the forensic work. And the question that hangs over every subsequent measurement of Lake Mead's declining water level is the same question Lieutenant Ray Spencer posed on camera in May 2022. What else is down there? What else did those years of deep, dark, cold water conceal? How many more barrels? How many more decisions made in backroom agreements, sealed with violence and submerged with confidence, are waiting for the water to finally reveal them? The Lake Mead National Recreation Area National Park Service has said it anticipates more artifacts to emerge as water levels continue to recede, noting that the lake has a storied history in its 90 years as a national park unit with a variety of cultural and historical artifacts, and that as water levels recede and fluctuate, It is possible that artifacts both known and unknown may show themselves. Artifacts both known and unknown. That is federal government language for, we do not fully know what is in this lake. After 90 years of operation, after decades of diving programs and surveys and recreational use by millions of visitors, after all of that, the agency responsible for this reservoir is openly acknowledging that its inventory is incomplete, that there are things in that water that nobody has cataloged, things that may not surface for years, things that the continued decline of the lake will slowly, inevitably push toward the surface. This is not just an environmental story. This is an archaeological story, a forensic story, a geopolitical story about water and power and the future of the American West. All of it compressed into a lake that is, by every measurable indicator, continuing to shrink. Using a conservative approach that assumes 2026 could bring another dry winter, researchers posit a rocky future for the 40 million people whose water is the subject of intense negotiations between 7 states. A rocky future for 40 million people. In a negotiation that has already missed multiple federal deadlines and now requires third-party mediation between parties who have known each other for a century and still cannot agree on how to divide a river that is running out. And still the lake keeps dropping. Still the shoreline keeps advancing inland. Still, the pale white bathtub ring of mineral deposits on the canyon walls around Lake Mead keeps growing taller, marking every foot of water that has been lost, like a calendar counting down. Park rangers walk those new shorelines with an alertness that was not required 5 years ago. Because now they know. Now everyone knows. The lake has been keeping secrets, and a drying lake, it turns out, is a very poor keeper of secrets indeed. The body in the barrel has a name that nobody has been able to confirm. The WW2 vessel that rested in its man-made grave for more than half a century is now visible to tourists with cameras and questions. The reservoir that sustains the American Southwest's largest cities is running equations that do not add up, heading toward outcomes that no negotiation has yet found a way to prevent. And the question that nobody in power is fully answering is the one that ties all of these threads together. How many more things did we put into this water, believing they would stay there forever? And what happens to a civilization built on assumptions of permanence when the permanence finally runs out? The lake does not answer. It only recedes, and every foot it falls reveals another fragment of a hidden world that was never meant to be seen by anyone, ever. Something bigger is coming. The water is making sure of that.